This is the story of Jingle Bells. You can read along with me in your book. You will know it is time to turn the page when you hear the chimes ring like this. Let's begin now. Fanny Bright and her brother Joshua lived with their grandfather on the prettiest farm in Kincaid County. Fanny was 8 years old. Joshua was 15. And grandfather was just about as old as most grandfathers are. Oh, yes, and we mustn't forget Charlie. Charlie was their horse. Grandfather was always bringing Charlie tasty treats.
Charlie, you old-timer, here's a nice big carrot for you.
Nobody knew exactly how old Charlie was. Not even Charlie. But for as long as anyone could remember, Grandfather had been hitching him to the plow every spring, to the buggy every summer, and to the harvest wagon every fall. And every winter, for as long as anyone could remember, Charlie was harnessed up to Grandfather's one-horse open sleigh for the big Christmas Day sleigh race. Grandfather often said,
"No doubt about it, Charlie is one fine horse."
Each year, with Fanny, Joshua, and Charlie's help, Grandfather's farm grew bigger, with more fields to plow and more crops to harvest. One day, Grandfather hitched Charlie to the buggy and called Fanny and Joshua.
"I think it's time for us to get another farm horse. Charlie's getting along in years, and there's too much farm work for him to do alone."
So they climbed in the buggy and rattled off down the road. A short time later, they pulled into McGregor's horse farm. Grandfather waved to Mr. McGregor.
"Good day, Mac. I need a strong young horse to help Charlie on the farm."
"I'm sure we'll be able to find just what you need. I have several you can choose from."
While the two men talked, Fanny and Joshua explored the farm. They looked in the clean white barns, then walked to the pasture fence and watched the horses grazing in the field. Suddenly, one of them trotted toward Fanny. Joshua laughed.
"I guess he wants to say hello."
Look at his forehead. That white mark looks just like a bell.
Grandfather and Mr. McGregor were standing outside the stables when Fanny came running up to them. She tugged on her grandfather's hand.
Come and see the horse Josh and I found.
As Grandfather looked over the horse at the pasture fence, Fanny pleaded.
Can't we buy him, Grandfather?
Mr. McGregor spoke up.
"He's just what you were looking for."
Grandfather thought for a minute, then looked at Fanny and smiled.
"We'll take him."
Grandfather tethered him to the back of the buggy, and they headed for home. On the way, Fanny kept staring at the new horse trotting along behind them.
What will we call him, Grandfather?
"You found him, Fanny. I think you should choose the name."
Fanny looked back at the new horse. She saw the mark on his forehead and shouted,
Jingle Bells!
The horse's ears shot up to listen. Fanny grinned.
I think we'll call you Jingle Bells.
Jingle Bells had never been on a real farm before. His whole life had been spent on Mr. McGregor's horse farm, where all he had to do was eat and sleep and gallop over the fields. He had never been hitched to a plow or pulled a buggy. On Grandfather's farm, Jingle Bells would have a lot to learn. When they got back from Mr. McGregor's, Fanny gave Jingle Bells a big hug and led him to his stall.
Here you are, boy. This is going to be your new home.
The next day, Grandfather began teaching Jingle Bells how to be a farm horse. During his first lesson, Jingle Bells tangled up his bridle. Grandfather grinned.
"He seems a bit clumsy."
During his second lesson, Jingle Bells backed the buggy into a fence. Grandfather shook his head.
He's definitely clumsy.
And on the third day of Jingle Bell's lessons, when he stumbled and pulled Grandfather and his plow into a ditch, Grandfather yelled,
He's the clumsiest horse I've ever seen.
Grandfather was ready to give up.
Well, Fanny, I think we've made a mistake. Jingle Bells will never learn to be a farm horse. Maybe we should take him back to Mr. McGregor.
Oh, no, Grandfather, please. Let me try to teach him. I know he can do it.
Grandfather could see that Fanny would be heartbroken if he sent the horse back.
All right, Fanny. Jingle Bells is your pupil now.
All through the fall, Fanny spent her after-school hours working with Jingle Bells in the training paddock. Little by little, day by day, the clumsy horse began to understand the mysteries of the bridle, the harness, and the saddle. Fanny was happy with Jingle Bell's progress, but Grandfather wasn't convinced.
He's still no farm horse, and he'll never be half the horse Charlie is.
When the first snowfall came in late November, Fanny thought of a way to prove Jingle Bells was a good horse. She would enter him in the Christmas Day sleigh race. Fanny asked her brother Joshua to help, but he had his doubts about the idea.
I'm not sure Jingle Bells is ready. Besides, Grandfather will be racing in our sleigh with Charlie.
What about that old sleigh out and back? Let's fix it up for the race.
When Fanny told Grandfather her plan, he looked doubtful too.
I know you've worked hard with Jingle Bells, but he's still clumsy. And a sleigh race can be pretty tricky. Even Charlie had trouble learning to run on that icy road.
But Fanny was confident.
I know he can do it.
For the next month, Fanny and Joshua worked during every spare minute, repairing the old sleigh and training Jingle Bells. A few days before Christmas, they were ready for their first test run. Fanny held the reins lightly.
Okay, boy. Here we go. Nice and slow at first.
Jingle Bells trotted smoothly down the snow-covered lane.
Now a little faster, boy.
Jingle Bells started a slow gallop. Joshua held on tight.
Okay, Fanny, let's see what he can do.
Fanny signaled Jingle Bells, and he broke into a full gallop. Just then he came to a patch of hard ice on the road. Jingle Bells slipped and slid, sending the sleigh crashing into a snowbank. Joshua and Fanny got up out of the drift just as Grandfather and Charlie came along. Grandfather sighed.
I know you love Jingle Bells, but he'll be lucky just to stay on the course. Be careful, and think about just watching the race.
As Grandfather trotted off, Joshua sighed.
You know, Fanny, maybe he's right.
No, let's try again. Remember, Grandfather said it even took Charlie a while to get the hang of this, and he's a great horse.
Off they sped again. As Jingle Bells' flying hooves sprayed snow everywhere, Fanny whispered to herself,
Jingle Bells just has to win.
Finally, Christmas Day arrived. It was clear and cold, and the center of town was crowded with horses and sleighs. Men, women, boys and girls, grandfathers, and even a grandmother or two were holding the reins on colorful one-horse open sleighs. It took a while for all the sleighs to get into starting position. When everybody was lined up, the mayor fired the starting gun. They were off. Sleighs and horses darted from the starting line. The muffled sound of hoofbeats on the snowy road sounded like distant thunder. Jingle Bells started out slowly. but steadily he closed in on the top 3 sleighs. Fanny shouted.
Look, the third sleigh. It's Grandfather and Charlie.
Joshua pointed ahead.
Better slow down, Fanny. We're coming to Calamity Curve.
Calamity Curve was the worst turn in the race. Just as they were passing Grandfather and Charlie, Fanny tugged at Jingle Bell's reins. The horse slowed as he approached the treacherous curve. Gingerly, he trotted through the turn and began picking up speed again. Joshua looked around them.
Fanny, where did Grandfather and Charlie go?
Fanny glanced back over her shoulder.
Grandfather's over the edge. Charlie slipped on Calamity Curve. We'll have to go back.
She pulled at the reins. Just for a moment, Jingle Bells didn't understand. But Fanny kept tugging, and Jingle Bells slowed, then stopped. Fanny had trained him well. As the other horses and sleighs raced by, Fanny turned Jingle Bells around, and they headed back to Calamity Curve. When they arrived, Fanny tossed the reins to Joshua and jumped out of the sleigh. Moving through the deep drifts as fast as she could, she came to the scene of the crash. To the right was the sleigh. To the left, Charlie lay tangled in the reins. And between them, Grandfather was stuck in the snow up to his waist. Fanny called out,
Are you all right, Grandfather?
Grandfather was too cold and wet to answer, but he did manage a nod and a tired grin. Joshua hurried up behind her and began to dig Grandfather out of the snow. Fanny, meanwhile, untangled Charlie from the twisted reins and calmly led the chilled horse out of the drifts. They wrapped Grandfather in a warm blanket and helped him into the sleigh. Then, with Charlie trotting along behind, Jingle Bells pulled them toward home, where a big Christmas dinner was waiting. Grandfather put his arm around Fanny.
Well, it looks like Jingle Bells might make a farm horse after all. Of course, Charlie would have beaten him in the race if he hadn't slipped.
Fanny couldn't believe her ears.
Grandfather, Jingle Bells had already passed Charlie. We would have won.
Before Grandfather could answer, Joshua piped up.
I guess we'll have to wait until next Christmas to know for sure.
Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh. O'er the fields we go, rattling all the way. Bells on bobtail ring, making spirits bright. What fun it is to
That was the end of the story. If you would like to hear it again, turn the tape over.